Hello, everyone. Good to see you all back in the room as we're heading into the afternoon of today's Child Safety Conference. And before we go dive into our next panel on digital literacy, we will hear from Julie Inman-Grant, who's here, not here, but here on the screen, to give a keynote speech. She's Australia's e-safety commissioner, and in this role, she leads the world's first government regulatory agency committed to keeping its citizens safer online. She's involved in several international working groups. For example, she's the chair of the Child Dignity Alliance's technical working group, and she also serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Coalition for Digital Safety. Over to you, Julie.
G'day, bonjour, and goeiedag. My name's Julie Inman-Grant, and I'm Australia's e-safety commissioner. We weren't to know in December 2019 that COVID would go on to claim millions of lives, damage hundreds of millions more, and that a global pandemic would soon become one of the defining issues of our time. However, let's not forget that something remarkable happened along the way. In the pursuit of a solution, the pandemic brought together the best minds, years of research, innovation, vast amounts of funding, and the will to achieve incredible results in record time. And within a year, we had vaccines that continue to save lives. The way the pandemic galvanized the scientific community and governments around the world was unprecedented. It spurred global cooperation for vaccine research and distribution without compromising safety. The only delay was the need to test the vaccines on humans and secure government approvals. We had to be sure that the vaccines were safe before we put them into our bodies. That protection, that guarantee, had to be built in. You could say it was a perfect example of safety by design. So, is it unreasonable to ask that the technology industry do the same? After almost 30 years, should we not expect its best minds, years of research, innovation, and money to find a way to make the internet safer for children? All that's missing is the will to achieve. Make no mistake, technology companies have always known how people turn online platforms into weapons that generate abuse and cause real world harms. I know. I joined the ranks of the technology industry in 1995, a time I fondly refer to as tech policy ground zero. The technological weaponization of our children is even more dire now than it was back then. Today, pedophiles exploit apps like Skype to live stream child sexual abuse on demand and to commit sexual extortion with no real efforts by the platforms to prevent such devastating misuse. We're even at a point now where searching only for known child sexual abuse material won't solve the problem. This is because children are being groomed and coerced into producing their own child sexual exploitation content on their own devices, in their own homes, using many of the platforms we use and depend on daily. Now, if the owners and creators of the devices and platforms and services that enable the creation and distribution of the tsunami of child sexual exploitation material are not willing to halt at source, on platform, and prior to posting or distribution, then who will? Who will? To have the companies who create and profit from these online platforms say that child safety is too hard or is not our responsibility is simply unacceptable. And in recent months, I've heard both refrains from industry. The internet started going mainstream in the mid 1990s when I joined the tech industry. And yet, here we are still talking about how to solve the most fundamental safety issues after all this time. That's because the so called solutions from the big tech companies have been no more than aspirins and band aids. What we need now is the equivalent of an internet vaccine. We could say the COVID world of masks, sanitizing, and social distancing has its parallels in the online world. Things like parental controls, honest conversations with our children, and managing their devices and screen time. They each provide some level of protection. However, in the fight against COVID, nothing has been more effective than the systemic response our bodies generate from a vaccine. We need the same jolt for our technology ecosystem, up and down the stack. We need stronger immunity for our children against the ills of the internet. And building safety into our technology, just like providing that systemic protection of vaccines, is the most powerful thing we can do. The good news is we already have the vaccine, and we may have several more in development. We already have the tools that allow companies to build safety into their apps and online platforms. We call it safety by design. Now, safety by design is not just an initiative or a concept. It's not just a principles based framework. It is all these things, but it's much, much more. Principles alone do not lead to tangible change. And meaningful cultural and behavioral change take a long time to have an effect and become routine. That is why we at the eSafety Commissioner spent 4 years working with representatives from industry, NGOs, advocacy groups, and expert advisors. We wanted to convince the platforms that they could change the ethos of product design, development, and deployment by making user safety and well-being core considerations. Our aim was to create resources that make safety by design meaningful, actionable, achievable, and effective. The result was a set of interactive risk assessment tools tailored for both startups and enterprises that will produce the equivalent of a safety impact assessment. So far, these interactive tools have been accessed in more than 45 countries, helping users and companies understand the how of building safety in by design. The tools help companies of all sizes and structures to develop safer products. They help embed safety into the culture, ethos, and operations of their businesses. The only way we will make the online world safer is for the platforms themselves to become part of the community developing protections, the same way our scientific community developed vaccines. And I'm pleased to report that safety by design is gaining traction where it matters. CEOs and senior leadership from global tech companies such as Google, Lego, Nextdoor, Meta, Roblox, Snap, and TikTok are engaging with the tools. They've also publicly committed to strengthening their safety by design practices. And this is vital as we hurdle towards an even more complexity with immersive technologies, deepfakes and GANs, crypto, the blockchain, and distributed computing, none of which will have any workable solutions around remediating personal harms. Many of the medium tier platforms have proven more nimble in implementing safety protections and more innovative in their deployment. We've also seen them be more responsive when things do go wrong. Take Yuba's rapid response to the Uvalde shooters' spraying of threats of misogynistic violence and the sharing of weapons on their platform within the week. Or Discord's broad release of AutoMod, an autonomous moderation tool designed to take the strain off human moderators having to constantly engage with damaging content. Or even TikTok's recent release of screen time controls. We continue to see platforms invest in tools to educate and empower users and to simplify processes so that users can easily report. And this is good. In Australia, we're seeing our banking sector being more responsive to safety by design than even the local tech sector. The banks are identifying and rooting out online harassment and other forms of technology facilitated abuse in banking transactions, which we often see in cases of domestic violence or in custody battles. And we have clearly seen over the past few years that the gaming sector understands how abuse and toxicity on their platforms can undermine user retention, with gamers voting with their feet. So we were pleased to recently see Blizzard Games additional and clear safety updates. But what we are seeing in terms of safety protections is incremental rather than monumental, and evolutionary rather than revolutionary. We know that the threat vectors are constantly changing. We know digital first responders are being flooded with sexual extortion that targets young people. We know groomers are coercing children to self-produce material that exploits them sexually on the same apps, ISPs, and platforms that are pushing back on regulation. Predators are using their search engines to seek out new victims. They are exploiting dodgy apps like Kik or Omegle, or increasingly sharing CSAM on encrypted apps like Wicker, Signal, or Telegram, where safety by design is anathema. We now know that we need vaccines to permeate every corner of the world to achieve a suitable level of global immunity and to prevent the proliferation of virulent new strains of COVID. The same holds true in the online world. No one is truly safe until every user, platform, and app is inoculated. Therefore, we must send the strongest of messages to the industries providing us with online interactivity. You have fundamental responsibilities, and it is way past time that you started to meet them. Now, I was in Europe just last month, and I met with many CEOs and tech leaders, including those from the major US tech companies. They were all singing a pleasing and harmonized refrain that they and their organizations are leaning in to regulation. However, I came back to Australia to negotiate the implementation details of our new regulations. And let me tell you, not everyone got the memo. Those local company reps were not singing from the same song sheet. While the tech industry leaders will say they are doing everything they can to prevent harm to children, their actions on the digital regulation front line reveals a very different story. And as European policymakers embark upon their own online harms regulatory regimes, they too need to be prepared for this. For instance, Australia's mandatory industry codes set forth an obligation for a broad range of technology providers to proactively detect and remove child sexual abuse material. This is a requirement I have redlined, yet we still have had pushback every step of the way. ISPs and telcos say they only provide dumb pipes, but while they can detect and address malware and ransomware, they're unable to do the same for child sexual abuse or pro-terrorist content. Established cloud hosting providers have told us it's too hard to change their acceptable use policies to clearly articulate to customers that they cannot host child sexual exploitation services in their data centers, even if a regulator or law enforcement brings it to their attention. Every segment of the tech sector has pushed back against taking proactive steps that require them to do more than the status quo. If they are not content for this abhorrent content to live on their services, they are only committing to detecting known CSAM, which may be years or even decades old. Meanwhile, children are using their devices, their platforms, and their services to create, host, and distribute extremely damaging sexualized material that may injure, haunt, and traumatize them for the rest of their lives. This is not a potential harm or a future threat. This is happening now. It's happening at scale. We need to shift the responsibility back onto these platforms now, too, to take meaningful action for the devastation they are facilitating. And we need to work together across boundaries and borders to hold these companies to account. Online safety regulation is by no means a foregone conclusion as far as tech companies are concerned. So governments and civil society everywhere need to recognize this is still a fight. And it's worth fighting for because we're talking about the dignity of our children and the sanctity of childhood. To my mind, this reluctance to root out child sexual exploitation material on the platforms and devices these companies profit from, to future proof our child's safety, is deplorable. If consumers can be targeted with deadly precision for the purposes of advertising, surely illegal and seriously harmful content and conduct can be targeted too. Enough with the principles, enough with the platitudes. We've run out of patience. We need to treat this online scourge like the global pandemic that it is. Please receive my words today as Australia's dispatch from the front lines. E-safety has been regulating the tech sector for a range of personal harms for 7 years, and I'm letting you know that you should expect the same pushback in Europe as well. In Australia, we have reformed our legislation and we are taking the steps to test whether safety by design is being meaningfully deployed. Soon, we expect to start issuing notices to a range of platforms under our new basic online safety expectations regime. These expectations will help make sure online services are safer for all Australians. They will also encourage the tech industry to be much more transparent about their safety features, policies, and practices. This will compel the much needed transparency about what companies are actually doing to prevent online harm to our children. Transparency that tech companies have not given voluntarily to date. The basic online safety expectations are backed by new civil penalties for online service providers that do not meet their reporting obligations. We're also getting closer to the mandatory industry codes in Australia I mentioned earlier, and these codes will apply to wide sections of the online industry. When registered, the codes can require online platforms and service providers to detect and remove illegal content like child sexual abuse. The codes will be enforceable by civil penalties and injunctions to make sure that online service providers comply. We welcome Europe's commitment to developing robust new laws to combat a range of online harms. We are glad you too are joining this fight, and we want to work with you. And while we want to make the internet safer for all Australians, we consider this a global fight. We want the children of Europe and Asia and Latin America and Africa to be safer too. Accepting that we will have different models and approaches, we are happy for you to learn from our experiences, what we've learned the hard way, and what we continue to learn every day. We want to give you the intelligence we've gleaned from over 7 years of remediating online harms. We want you to be successful because your success is our success, and all of the children of the world will be much safer. There is no question we are living in such challenging times. Our politics are polarized. The great nations of the world view each other with fear and distrust. The cost of living in most countries is soaring, while stock markets are falling. So it's natural in such times to want to look inward, to retreat, to bunker down, and to be insular. However, the mistake we cannot make is to be so insular that we don't see the internet as the global force without boundaries, and the metaverse and Web 3.0 as the next version of the internet. Yes, we must protect our own citizens, especially our children, but we've also got to protect the children of the world. And just as we've learned with COVID, unless everyone is safe, no one is safe. Thank you.